Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Orlins. I'm president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm very happy to be joined today by Thilo Hanemann and an outstanding panel. This is the 6th year of the National Committee's partnership with the Rhodium Group. And what we try to do in terms of U.S.-China relations is provide data to allow policymakers and the public to make decisions as to what the right policies and laws should be. This year, we have somewhat deviated from our model and have created an analysis which we call an outbound investment screening regime for the United States. And it looks at what a potential law would do to US investment in China. Thilo will first talk for around 20 minutes, and then we'll be joined by the panelists who I will introduce when they come on screen. Thilo, as everybody knows, is a partner at the Rhodium Group, and he leads the firm's work on global trade and investment and has been the lead in the partnership with the National Committee over these 6 years and has authored, I think, 11 previous analyses of U.S.-China investment. But Thilo, thank you so much for the work. Thank you for shedding light when there's lots of smoke. And thank you for all of the work that you do with the committee.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone. As Steve just mentioned, the mission of the U.S.-China Investment Project is to provide data and objective analysis on U.S.-China investment dynamics to inform policymakers, businesses, and the broader public. And each year we publish regular data updates, and then occasionally we also put together special reports on important issues pertinent to U.S.-China capital flows. Today, we want to discuss a new and potentially really important policy initiative that could have a significant impact on future U.S.-China investment relations, namely a potential outbound investment review mechanisms here in the United States, targeting China and other so-called countries of concern. This morning, we have released a short background report that provides context on the legislation, which you can find on our website. And I will take the next 20 minutes or so to summarize the highlights of that report before we head into the panel discussion. Great, looks like I have a deck here. Could we go to the next slide, please? Fantastic, great. So I'd like to start with this historical perspective that illustrates just how much policy and policy changes have driven and have shaped U.S.-China investment flows over the past 2 decades. So this slide here shows the past 2 decades of U.S.-China direct investment as well as venture capital investment, and a few of the most important policy markers in green here. So all the way to the left-hand side, of course, it was a combination of China's opening up FDI reforms and liberal U.S. economic policies, W2 accession, that fueled the initial rise of US FDI into China. About a decade later, you can see the red bars popping up, which was really driven by the liberalization of Chinese outbound FDI policies, which has boosted Chinese outbound FDI into the US and globally. And then a few years later, it was the reversal of these Chinese outbound FDI, or backpedaling on these liberal Chinese outbound FDI policies that have triggered a major drop again in this red bar since 2017. What also contributed to that drop was the overhaul of US inbound FDI policies, namely the so-called FIRRMA legislation in 2018, which reformed the inbound FDI review mechanism in the US. And as we head into 2022, there is now additional US policy at the horizon, namely a new mechanism to scrutinize American outbound investment to China. And we want to now dive a little bit deeper into what it has been driving these policies and what the potential impact could be. Next slide, please. So I want to start with a little bit of background on what's driving this new legislation. And sort of at the core, these new proposals that we're seeing out there are really based on two long-standing concerns in Washington that have received additional traction in the context of increasing U.S.-China competition, or great power competition, if you want. Next slide, please. The first long-standing concern is that U.S. investment in China could facilitate the transfer or the build-up of technology and know-how that could, in the long run, strengthen China's civil and military capabilities to the detriment of the United States. And again, these concerns date really back to the 1990s or even 1980s when Congress was concerned about joint venture requirements, local content requirements. But in the past decade, they have multiplied because of a number of reasons. Number one, China's technology development, of course, getting China closer to the cutting edge in many new and emerging technologies that have potential dual use applications. We've seen a big expansion of US firms' innovation footprint in China. So it's not just about joint ventures anymore or local content requirements, but US investors have become an active part of China's innovation system. In our data set alone, we have more than $25 billion in semiconductor and other ICT investment into China since 2010. We have more than 50 billion of US startup financing over the past 2 decades, including in emerging technologies with potential dual use. And right now we're at about $4 to $5 billion of annual US R&D investments, R&D expenditures in China. So US companies spend about $4 to $5 billion a year in China on R&D. And then last but not least, of course, what amplifies and ties these concerns together is the existence of a very deep civil military fusion program in China and the lack of rule of law, which makes it very, very difficult, or some say impossible, for Chinese firms to keep that homegrown Chinese technology away from the military and military use. Next slide, please. A second long-standing concern that is getting more and more traction in recent years is the outsourcing of critical production capacity to China. Initially, these offshoring concerns have mostly focused on the labor and social impacts, but they're now really centered around supply chain security. So the ability of the United States to ensure access to critical goods and services in the face of certain disruptions arising from conflict, natural disasters, economic coercion, and the likes. And I'd say 2 things have really amplified those concerns over the last decade or even 5 years, if you want to narrow it down. Number one, China is now really dominating certain parts of the supply chain through both its natural competitive advantage, but then also the use of subsidies, industrial policies, and other measures that have gotten China to a point where it now occupies a significant market share, not just in those competitive advantage areas, but also in areas in which it does not have a competitive advantage. And then second, we have some clear evidence that China has used this kind of supply chain leverage both as a carrot and a stick in its relations with other countries. We have seen disputes with Australia, South Korea, Japan, and others in which Beijing has either threatened or imposed boycotts or blocked access to key inputs and components. And certainly the global pandemic has further aggravated these types of concerns about reliance on Chinese suppliers. We can dive into some of these concerns a little later during the panel, but I think those are the 2 main important pillars of concerns that are driving this legislative agenda. Next slide, please. So how have these concerns manifest themselves in Washington? Next slide, please. Over the past 2 years, we've seen a long series of legislative proposals and executive orders in response to these concerns about tech transfer and critical capabilities. This is not the full list. This is just a small selection of some of the most important policies that have either been enacted or are currently pending. And we bucketed them into 3 areas. The first one on top here are broader China-related legislative proposals, like USChina, and just this week we have the House version of that, the America Competes Act. We have a number of supply chain reshoring proposals, including the CHIPS Act. And then last but not least, we have a number of export control initiatives and overhauls. And what we want to focus on today is the one in red, is the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, which is a bilateral piece of legislation introduced by Senators Cornyn and Casey. And if you move to the next slide, I have a short overview of what that piece of legislation specifically means. The bill would basically establish an interagency committee led by USTR to review certain US outbound investments, so outbound investments by American companies or foreign companies based in the US. And it would scrutinize transactions that would shift or relocate to a country of concern or transfer to an entity of concern the design, development, manufacture of critical capabilities. One important feature is that there is a mandatory notification provision for covered industries and transactions. So a very important element of the bill is to create some additional transparency around these critical capabilities, supply chain dependencies, and some better data for US government agencies to track offshoring dynamics. If that committee ultimately determines that a transaction poses a risk to critical capabilities, it can either recommend the president to block it, or it can also recommend to Congress to establish or expand specific programs to support the supply of critical capability in that area connected to the transaction. Next slide, please. In addition to this broader process, the current version of the NCCDA bill also specifies a list of critical capabilities, which you can see on the left-hand side here, and a list of additional industries for review. Most of those, as you can see, are relatively narrow and not surprising. So of course you have defense on there, and you have certain disaster relief dimensions, but it also includes fairly broad categories like transportation and critical infrastructure, which are, as we can see in a minute, not quite narrowly defined. So we understand that the bill is still work in progress, but as I mentioned earlier, we just had a House version of the America Competes Act come out this week, and the latest version of this Cornyn Casey bill is in that legislative proposal, which is now in the House, and lawmakers will work through it over the next weeks and months. And we certainly can take a closer look during the panel on how this may play out over the next few weeks. Next slide, please. Last thing we try to do in our report is to provide some initial perspectives on the implications of such a bill. An impact assessment is extremely difficult because the impacts of the bill or the regime itself will depend on the ultimate legislative text, as well as the detailed implementation rules and the interpretation of the law by the executive branch and regulators. But in the spirit of our mission here to provide some data and objective economic analysis for policymakers, we have attempted to put a few data points and perspectives together, which we hope can serve as a starting point for discussing the implications for U.S.-China capital flows, U.S. companies in the global economy, and then global economic governance more broadly. So starting with the impact on U.S. FDI in China, if you could move to the next slide, please. The first exercise we have undertaken is trying to answer the question of what would the NCCDA legislation mean for U.S. investment, U.S. companies in China. So what we've done is we've taken our historical data set of more than 6,000 individual U.S. FDI transactions in China to determine how many transactions occurred in sectors or activities relevant to the national critical capability as defined under the bill. And as you can see here, the results are quite expansive. We find that in its current form, the bill would have potentially covered about 43% of historical US FDI transactions into China in volume terms, and about 45% of US FDI into China over the past 2 decades in value terms. So a fairly large share. Beyond
what's that total value, Thilo?
The total
accumulated value, I guess not mark to market.
The total value that we have in our database is about 160 billion, if I'm not mistaken, in that time frame. So that is the impact, a rough impact assessment in terms of new transactions. Beyond the potential impact on new investment, one dimension that we think has not gotten enough attention right now is what effect such legislation may have on existing US operations in China. Although the screening mechanism itself is not going to be applied retroactively, greater scrutiny could put additional pressure on existing US operations in China and ultimately even force certain firms to reduce or divest their operations. That could occur through follow-on investment, retrofitting or upgrading not being approved. It could trickle through lower competitiveness of US companies in the Chinese market due to higher transaction costs, regulatory costs, compliance costs. And then certainly one dimension we can't foresee yet is possible retaliation from Beijing against American companies in response to a new regime like that. Now, some on the Hill may say, yes, that's great. That's exactly what we want to achieve with this. But it is really important to not forget that these US operations in China currently generate 500 to 600 billion in annual profits for American companies, which ultimately all contribute to R&D budgets and other functions that are very, very important for US prosperity, and then ultimately US national security. So really important to broaden the horizon there a little bit and think about those second order impacts. Next slide, please. A second argument one needs to consider is how an outbound investment screening regime may impact US companies or the US economy as a whole. And we've put together a few numbers to show how the US was historically a leader of liberal global investment policies, and that leadership has been one reason for the US having far, far more inbound and outbound FDI stocks than any other country on the planet, which you can see here on the slide, almost $20 trillion in combined inbound and outbound FDI stock, far, far, far more than any other economy out there. So an outbound investment screening regime would represent a major break from that liberal investment, open investment tradition. And if the legislation is enacted, ultimately, the US would be one of only a handful of advanced economies with industry-specific outbound investment restrictions. I think Japan has a few requirements. South Korea has them, and I guess there's Taiwan as well, who has such provisions. But other than that, the US would be the only large OECD economy that has such a regime in place. And if not designed in a targeted, predictable manner, this change, of course, could negatively impact the global competitiveness of US companies in the affected industries, and then vice versa, because the legislation would presumably also apply to foreign companies operations in the US, it could also undermine the attractiveness of the United States as an investment location on the inbound side if the legislation limits the global deployment of US-based operations or any IP and assets associated with those US-based operations. Next and last slide, please. Finally, one last dimension that we think is important to consider is what such a change could mean for the global investment policy dimension. We have just gone, and that's what this chart here is showing, through a major overhaul of global inward FDI policies, really across the globe, which has been in part driven by concerns about China, in part by the pandemic, and a decision by the US to introduce an outbound FDI screening mechanism might encourage other countries, US allies, to consider similar steps, which on the one hand could help coordination on certain national security questions, but of course in a worst case scenario could also lead to another wave of less liberal investment policies that creates additional regulatory barriers for cross-border investment flows globally, which is bad news from an open investment perspective. And certainly, if you remember the last chart that I showed, the companies that would suffer most from that would be US multinationals. There is, of course, also a possibility that other countries could view US outbound investment restrictions as going too far and not follow suit, in which case that could complicate rather than enhance multilateral coordination in responding to some of the economic and national security challenges posed by China. And certainly one specific areas to watch is the slowly unfolding collaboration, the transatlantic collaboration between Europe and the US on China. I would be very surprised if proposals like this would be picked up in the European context. So it could really cause additional friction here for these multilateral transatlantic or OECD economy coordination with respect to China. I will pause here. Thank you for your attention. We will now switch over to our panel discussion to drill down on some of these areas and questions in more detail. Back to you, Steve, to kick us off on that.
Great. If the panelists can turn on their videos, that would be terrific. You have got their bios, so I won't go over everything. You know, Giovanna is at the law firm of Morgan Lewis and runs their international trade and national security practice. Nargiza, is that correct? Is at the Rhodium Group and is in DC and runs and is part of their China projects team. And Eric Zheng, who we know from his days working in insurance over many decades in Shanghai, is now the president of the AmCham Shanghai. So wonderful to have all three of you. Let me start with Giovanna. Is this a solution looking for a problem? What is really the problem? Do we have a lot of examples of US investment in China jeopardizing national security of the United States?
Well, so thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. And that's a very insightful question, Steve, because I think it depends upon the perspective that you bring to the table. So who is looking to define that problem? If you talk to agencies in the US government that have defense, national security, and intelligence equities, you're likely to hear the answer that the development of indigenous capability in China, their concept of civil military fusion, the encouragement and financing by the Chinese government of the enhanced development of these industries, and the public policies that have been articulated by China develop a framework that raises some concerns. And so those communities are going to look at the players that are contributing to that. And to the extent that we have either technology transfer, product establishment of ventures or other joint collaborations, and it doesn't have to be industry, could also be universities, could be specific individuals. I think that suddenly puts together a picture that raises some concerns because of a lack of visibility. The majority of those types of activities don't have clarity and transparency. Even if you were to look at export control laws, the way the laws are established, especially the export administration regulations, the majority of the exports, according to the Bureau of Industry and Security's annual reports, are actually done through license exceptions. So no one has to inform the US government of what gets transferred. It's simply the invocation of an exception. So I think there could be some concerns as you look at certain stakeholders' perspectives.
The national security folks in the US government are paid to think about those problems. If you try and weigh the national security concerns versus what your clients would then,
Right.
the additional bureaucratic impediments that they would have in making investments in China, where do you come out? Worth it?
So I think it's actually a question for the clients, because as a counselor, I'm giving a legal analysis on it. But I think the issue becomes if those, as you call them, impediments, if the requirements and regulatory requirements have existed since the founding of most countries. So industry is used to being regulated in some fashion. I think a regulatory framework that does not meet an objective, Steve, would be fairly difficult to justify, because it is a potential impediment that doesn't meet an objective. If, however, there was a clearly articulated objective and a framework designed to meet it, then I think just like paying taxes, having to get patent applications through the system to get a patent, having to go through the government contracts process or Hart-Scott-Rodino, it becomes built into the conduct of business. Otherwise, I think you have to look a little bit more carefully.
Eric, how would it affect your members? How would it affect your membership if they had, I mean, General Motors is certainly a member of Shanghai AmCham. If they needed to increase their investment and they had to go through a regulatory process in the United States?
Well, obviously, there are a lot of uncertainties at this point. As Thilo pointed out, that over the past particularly 20 years since China joined the WTO, many of American companies have invested in this market. And now over half of them, at least based on our membership survey, they sell to the China market. Right? This is the market for them. And that's one factor to be considered. The other one is this market is becoming very innovative. For automakers like GM, they want to be here not only to sell, cars, Tesla and Buick and so forth to the China market, but also they wanted to tap into the innovation space. Chinese consumers are demanding for very innovative products, and digital plays a major role in this. So when you look at industries like EV, electric vehicle industry, China is leading the way. So if you ask American automakers to stay away from the China market, not only you are going to lose a huge potential market for US automakers, but also it's not going to help US automakers in terms of innovation, because they will love to work with Chinese companies to create, to commercialize new products, new parts, new auto cars for the China market, and eventually to sell those products to the rest of the world. So in my view, if we're going in this direction in terms of screening outbound investment by having very vague criteria for these so-called critical capabilities, this will make US companies less competitive.
Nargiza, where do we stand on this legislation? I mean, Thilo's described it. It's being talked about. What's the timeline? Will it be passed? What's your view on where we're going to go with this?
Thanks, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the honest but unfortunate answer is it depends, and it depends on many things. Certainly, the first threshold is to pass the bill, and I see no reason why the House would not pass the bill probably quite quickly. And when and if it does, both chambers will have to negotiate to resolve the differences. There are some pretty obvious differences between the Senate version of the bill and the version that the House has passed, not least of which is, of course, the inclusion of this particular piece of legislation within America Competes Act. And that will require intense negotiation. If we think back over many years of congressional action in this particular space, original FIRRMA bill included an element that would have involved an outbound investment screening mechanism, and that was not in the final version because there was such intense negotiations, intense opposition, it couldn't clear the threshold. So I think House and Senate will have a lot of negotiating that they have to do before we see the final version of this bill pass.
So no prediction as to whether or when?
Think if we were betting people, but probably not for this audience.
Am I correct in stating that America has never had anything like this in terms of restricting outbound, having an approval process for outbound investment? What is so different about the relationship with China that we should look at doing something that we've historically never done? And as Thilo's slide points out, we have been the bright example of inward and outward FDI since World War II. Why mess with something that's worked pretty well? What's so different here? Any of you? Or Giovanna, that was most, I was thinking of you as I asked that question.
So let me start with your last comment about it's worked so well. I think there's a number of different views on whether things have worked well. I think there are some things that people believe have worked well. And then I think part of the reason we're here having this discussion is because there's been some indication that things have not worked well. I think in response to your question, Steve, there haven't been, in my understanding, any formal outbound type reviews, but there have been informal views. U.S. government policies and regulatory constructs that have disincentivized, for example, certain types of foreign investments. Companies are making decisions on the basis of those types of disincentives. And to a certain extent, that does constitute a form of impediment, if you will, to outbound investment. I think we're at a point now, though, and it's very interesting when you looked at the draft legislation, both the Senate side and the Competes Act, as Nargiza was saying, it doesn't actually say China, it says foreign adversaries. And foreign adversaries, that wonderful term, not really concretely defined, is open to interpretation, and it is more than one country. I think we hear a lot more about China because of the great power competition and the way in which the relationship has developed. But it's a broader bill in this sense, and I think it's identifying and highlighting a broader set of issues.
And if I could,
where have been the failures? In other words, we're talking about the failures. So we're needing to fix a system and put in place more regulatory burdens on US companies. Talk somewhat about the failures where we have effectively enabled the China military industrial complex to compete more with us as a result of US investment. Technology, we have rules on tech, as you doubtlessly in your practice experience, we have rules on technology transfer.
Right, but the devil is in the details, Steve. So I think the biggest problem has been the shift to lack of visibility. And let me just talk 2 seconds because I think Nargiza has some comments. Our US export control regimes are set up to not be prohibitions. I leave the sanctions regimes to the side. So our Export Administration Act regulations administered by Commerce and our Department of State International Traffic and Arms regulations, as well as our nuclear regs, are all designed to set up visibility and permissions. But what has happened over the years is the visibility has shrunk because the permissions have become self-effectuating or self-effective. So if I no longer have to advise a government agency to obtain permission to transfer, there is no manner in which the US government is able to discover, absent moving a product, which is not technology because a product has to cross a border and our customs service will track it. But technology is evanescent, goes by email, is out of the cloud, and there is no mechanism to have visibility into what is transferred. And I think that loss of visibility and accountability has contributed to transfers occurring that have now shifted the balance between China and the United States.
And just to add to that point, I think two important developments to keep in mind to set the broader context. First, the complexity of technology has changed dramatically. So when a lot of the rulemaking was originally established, a piece of technology was more or less whole on itself, as Giovanna has mentioned. Now it's sort of evanescent, you can just put it in an email. So the complexity of it means that it becomes increasingly more difficult to separate what is civilian from what is military. And of course, so many technologies nowadays are inherently dual use. And that's not a problem that's unique to technologies that are being developed in China or in the United States or anywhere else. So that's one. The second one is the complexity of the supply chains. It used to be that you knew where your widgets and gadgets came from, but now the global distribution, assembly, packaging, testing, it means that every node in your supply chain is potentially vulnerable to exploitation. It means that it could be just a product defect, so a quality issue. But either way, for the United States government to be able to scrutinize critical supply chains, and if we go back to this piece of legislation, right, the supply chain security is at the core of it. If you go back to that and sort of start thinking about how can the government ensure that the supply chain is protected, it needs to have visibility into what that supply chain is. An important part of the effort that we've seen undertaken in Congress, and certainly within the two administrations, most recently the bipartisan effort, it's try to understand what is going on, just educate itself to gain access to the information that it currently lacks.
And Steve, maybe just one last more historical comment, since you said the U.S. hasn't had that in place, probably fair to say, since shortly after World War II. But historically speaking, we have to just also recognize China is a very unique case, right? And there are unique concerns associated with China in terms of its particular economic system, in terms of its size and its situation as a non-allied economy, right? We never had a case like that before in the past 50 years. Japan was a very different case. So in the broader context, I would also tie it back to the evolution of China, Chinese practices, and some concerns about the differences in the US versus the Chinese system. And I would broaden it out and within market economies under the US security umbrella, that it's not just a tendency we're seeing in the US, but it's a very broad-based adjustment of some of these historical liberal economic policies.
Eric, talk about some of the report focuses, obviously it has this very interesting kind of analysis, as Thilo talked about, of the percentage of 43% of US investment in China. So neighborhood of $100+ billion would have been subject to this review. The report doesn't, Thilo made reference to it, but doesn't talk a lot about the benefits of US investment to not only China, but to the United States. Can you talk about that also to, how investors kind of bring their values, bring sometimes US products, they import US products into China that go into their finished product for distribution. Can you talk about some of those? Because I think that to some degree, this bill doesn't properly take into account those issues.
Yeah, certainly, Steve. When you look back, just 20 years since China joined the WTO, China has become increasingly integrated with the rest of the world in this more free kind of trade world system, which I believe, and many of our members believe, is in the best interest of the US and in the world. To have China as part of a responsible member of the global community, that's good for the world and certainly for the US. And when you look at China today, and we're actually going to celebrate, well, commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Shanghai Communique, which was signed 50 years ago by President Nixon and Premier Zhou Enlai. And China has come a long way since then, and certainly since China joined the WTO. And when you look outside of my windows here, you see so many American brands there. I could see Citi here, certainly GM, Tesla, Disney is a major player in this market. You see the integration, the benefit of integration between China and the rest of the world, certainly including the US. And I think in that sense, it's a very positive development. And obviously, we have two buckets of questions about the US and China bilateral relations. Which one is competition and the other is cooperation. And I hope, and our members certainly hope, that we can continue to work with China and find common ground, particularly in our case, in commercial space, find ways to engage China, to work with them. Certainly, this is becoming a very, very important market, consumer market for US companies. Based on our surveys, very consistently, China is regarded as one of the top, at least top 3 strategic markets for US companies. So when we think about a outbound investment screening mechanism, we need to keep that in mind as well, and how that kind of regime will have an impact on the future of these two countries. And I think we need to be careful, and certainly we have existing mechanisms such as export controls, economic sanctions, and is it possible to take a look at the existing mechanism rather than recreating a whole new set of a mechanism which will be unprecedented?
Nargiza, will the bill contain a provision which subjects its enforcement to, or the creation of this mechanism to some multilateral agreement? So if the EU, the Japanese, and the Koreans don't do it, and we do it, it's kind of like, what? It just is it's so anti-competitive for American companies. It kind of, it doesn't make any sense. Is there talk about kind of amending it to including some kind of contingent creation on whether we can get our allies and friends to work with us?
So the current language of the bill does contain a provision that directs the USTR, as the chairperson of this committee it would seek to establish, to coordinate multilaterally with allies and partners to address precisely sort of the concern you're raising, which is that the lack of coordination could disadvantage one party over the other, or just create a lot of incoherence, which unfortunately is a natural consequence sometimes in these types of rulemakings. It is not a contingent or a triggered situation, right? So it does not actually make US action in this event contingent on coordination with allies and partners. It just encourages that.
Giovanna, our export controls, do we coordinate with our allies? You know, in the old days when I started in this business, we had COCOM. You know, we you know, on the exports to the Soviet Union, we coordinated with the Europeans and the Brits and the Japanese, that if we couldn't export something, then nobody could export.
Right. So we do have multilateral coordination, certainly on the Commerce Department side under the Export Administration regulations. That is premised, if you listen to the management and leadership of the Bureau of Industry and Security, it is a multilateral based regime. It does have the capability, though, for certain circumstances, for some unilateral controls. And the export administration regulations do have certain types of technology, product, software, equipment, and materials that are subject to controls unilaterally. But the majority of it is based on Wassenaar, which was the replacement of COCOM, and also the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Australia Group, Missile Technology Control Regime. And on the State Department and the nuclear side as well, we do have similar systems, although under the International Traffic in Arms regulations, because it is defense and intelligence and military and focused in those areas, there is a broader capacity to exercise unilateral control because of sovereign concerns and issues. Same thing on the nuclear side, although there on the nuclear side, you have 1, 2, 3 agreements, you have Part 810, which is primarily premised on exchanges multilaterally. So there are a lot of multilateral premises in the export regimes. But let me observe, multilateral regimes are measured, considered, but some would say they are plodding, in the sense that all that coordination and all that interaction takes time, and people have to think about things, but technology doesn't stop for that. And whether you're looking at Moore's law or something else, it continues to progress. And by the time the multilateral regimes make a decision, the controls might be outdated. And that has always been a risk with that type of approach.
How do you think about the Chinese reaction? When I thought about, I will ask that question, but when I thought about it, I said, well, the Chinese do this anyhow. So they don't have much basis to object. But I don't know, Eric, how would you think the Chinese would respond if this bill gets passed and enacted?
Well, I think, based on our experience in the past, China could go to a third country for collaboration. And so it really would depend on whether European countries and Japan and so forth will work with the US in terms of implementing this new regime of outbound investment assessment. Because in the past, when the US decided not to export a certain technology to China, China could turn to another country in Europe, for instance, to get a similar technology. So at the end of the day, this may defeat the purpose of this new regime. So that's one possibility. Now, the other one certainly is self-reliance. This might hasten the process for China to go back to the old way of thinking. We have to rely on myself now. So which would not be good for either for China or for the rest of the world. So we would like to see China continue to be integrated with the rest of the world rather than creating its own kind of unique system of operations. So we would like to encourage China to continue to work with the rest of the world to become a more responsible player in the world stage. But this, if you try to isolate China in that way, this would not be helpful.
Giovanna, Nargiza, Thilo, anything to add on that?
So I agree with Eric's comments that the balance of equities is between the consequences of not integrating and the results of integrating. I do think if we look at what China has done over the last 2 years in response to actions taken by the United States and other countries, they've developed their own unreliable list. They've developed their own anti-foreign sanctions laws. To a certain extent, that brings them into the integrated world because a lot of countries have those types of laws. But at the same time, it is a reaction to what other sovereign countries have done. And I think one of the questions the US and partners and allies have to ask, are we prepared for those types of legal reactions that could occur? And then if those do occur and they get implemented, what are the consequences of that implementation? So it becomes a bit of a domino effect. So.
Yeah.
I think aside from that broader geopolitical perspective, there may be a few specific areas depending on how the law is designed that will be especially complicated, and one of them certainly is increased transparency into anything that sits in China, right? China has discovered that the protection of data and cross-border data flows is a national security matter. And as Giovanna mentioned, if one of the main purposes of this bill is to create additional transparency around what US companies are doing in China, to what extent the US depends on Chinese production, I can imagine that will put a lot of companies in a very difficult position if they are now forced to share some of that information on their Chinese operations with the US government through mandatory filings. So there are a few of these dimensions that could really be fairly concerning to Beijing and could be very damaging potentially to certain types of US companies.
What mechanisms exist already today that could achieve the goals that this legislation, through better enforcement, that this legislation attempts to achieve? Giovanna, you're probably the best one on that.
That is the $64,000 question. I mean, we have a lot of laws out there. I think the whole reason we're discussing this is because those laws don't seem to have been as effective. So I don't believe export controls can replace this view, because one, export controls really deal more in a transaction by transaction basis. I want to sell this product to this party in this country for this purpose, which is different than asking the question of what if I sell the capacity to make that product? What if I change the ownership of the producer? That is not a question that export control laws address in the licensing process. They might look at that from the reliability of the recipient to say, do they already have the capacity such that this unique single transfer will not alter the balance? But they do not look at that ownership. Neither do our sanctions laws. Our Defense Production Act does not look at that. IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, National Emergencies Act. So in that unique circumstance, we do not really have, at least of what I'm aware, a particular law that is focused on what happens if we change the ownership and control of our capacity. I think CFIUS is the closest mechanism we have, the FIRRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. But FIRRMA, like the export laws, and CFIUS, like the export laws, is a balance, because no government organization can look at the 20 to 40,000 investments, that cross-border investments that occur yearly. And so you have some balances, but even there, it's not an outbound investment regime, so it doesn't look at the situation in the same way. So apologies for the long-winded answer. I don't think there's anything out there right now.
But isn't most of the risk occur through technology transfer, not for the actual ownership interest?
Well, let me respond to your question with a question back to you. Is it the same if I take my technology, transfer it overseas, and indigenous capability is developed? Or what happens if I simply pay to build the facility and extremely intelligent people develop the indigenous capability? So on the first situation, the export laws might look at it, assuming I don't have the loss of visibility through the way the licensing mechanism is established. But in the latter, there's nobody that looks at that financing and establishing the facility that allows people who, for example, may have studied or worked with US or non-US companies and carry that knowledge with them to develop the capacity indigenously. And I think it's that particular gap that people are currently examining as to whether the visibility is needed to meet some of the concerns that certain stakeholders in the government have.
Interesting. Ken Jarrett, Eric, one of your predecessors, asked, I guess this is for Nargiza, is it likely the legislation's definition of outbound investment will include reinvested RMB profits of US companies already operating in China?
So I think part of what Congress is doing here is leaving a lot of the interpretation and definitions up to the executive branch when the legislation gets implemented. That's a very standard process, right? We know that before, after a law is signed, there is a consultative process where various stakeholders, interested parties, businesses, et cetera, are allowed to submit responses in response to solicitations that the responsible agency would issue. And I think that is going to be certainly one of the core questions that will need to be addressed.
Another question for you, which is it possible the review mechanisms will also consider human rights issues? For instance, proposed investments in Xinjiang or related to surveillance technology?
So the language of the bill as it stands right now does not make reference to human rights. We know that there are other pieces of legislation which have actually become law, for example, which do address that issue, but we don't see that in the current text.
But there are, sorry to interject here really quickly, I think there is a provision in there right now that allows certain members of Congress to initiate reviews, right? Which could be a potential backdoor to introduce some of these questions into the process. Again, depending on final text and implementation, but it could potentially happen through that way.
This is for everyone on the panel and Thilo. Is there any way we can kind of think about making this a productive issue between the United States and China? That we use this, the executive branch uses this bill to begin to talk to the Chinese about how we can bilaterally agree on what restrictions we put on FDI, that, you know, the Chinese are continually reducing their negative list. You know, what you cannot invest in. They're ending equity caps, and here we are, kind of putting, you know, with FIRRMA, with us, we're building higher walls. In a lot of ways, there's almost been a movement by both sides towards each other. The Chinese are getting slightly better, and we're getting slightly worse. So is there some way we could use this to kind of start talking to the Chinese? I don't know, Eric, you may be closest to that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think in the past, you know, we focus a lot on IP protection in terms of technology transfer, which China has made some progress, and I think they still got some way to go. So we also look at other areas of potentially cooperation. A big thing is the climate change, right? The U.S. government has discussed with the Chinese government about how to cooperate in this area, which is a global challenge. And when you deal with a global challenge, you need global solutions. And China has to be part of that cooperation. So I think, you know, when you look at this new bill, if this is the final legislation, depending on how you define critical capabilities, does that mean that the U.S. companies would not be able to work with Chinese companies in terms of resolving these climate change related challenges, which would not just simply be, you know, Chinese problems, it's a world problem. So I think implementation of this proposed bill will be a huge challenge. How do you define these categories, right? And also, how do you implement these rules for a interagency mechanism to review so many outbound investment proposals? That will be a bureaucratic nightmare. How do you do that? So that will definitely slow down business decisions by U.S. companies, which would not be good for our companies.
Nargiza or Thilo, did you want to, or Giovanna?
Seeing if anybody else unmutes. Steve, I don't see a natural collaboration emerging from this, but one point worth making potentially is that going back to Giovanna's comments, I think a really big motivation of all of this is to create greater clarity on supply chains and how much we rely on China at the moment and what some of the vulnerabilities are. So I think one potential really positive impact could be that, you know, once that regime is established and we have some more of that transparency, that regulators and policymakers will say, well, now we've achieved the goal. We know where we are vulnerable or not, what action we need to take, which then in turn will give us confidence to let some of the non-problematic investment, which would be the majority, I can imagine, happen. Similar to CFIUS, right? We need a gatekeeper to keep the bad stuff out, to let the majority of the good stuff happen. So I think ultimately that's a positive impact that I'm seeing.
You know, it's like one of the things in our Track 2 dialogues that we've been advocating for is an agreed definition of national security. So what we're getting is a enormously widening definition of national security, which is really not in the interests of the American people or the Chinese people, but certainly not in the interests of the American people, by creating duplication, by restricting innovation, by kind of blocking cooperation between the United States and China. My sister is being treated with a cancer drug developed by a joint venture between the United States and China called BeiGene. I mean, a company called BeiGene. I mean, we really want to block that? I mean, is this really bad for the American people? I just listen and I kind of go, wow, I think we have to be careful, very careful where we draw those lines. And as we see legislation coming up, the Chinese government is well aware of all of this legislation. I assure you, I certainly get lots of calls about particular pieces of legislation and kind of, why? You guys really want to do this? Is this in the interest of the American people? But using legislation to then have the executive branch negotiate something productive. Just a thought. Giovanna.
So Steve, you've mentioned a lot of thoughts. I think perhaps 3 observations. Every piece of legislation, every negotiation always has some bad outcome. I have been practicing for 35 years. I have yet to come across, at least in the areas I practice in, a piece of legislation or regulation that doesn't have an unintended consequence. And so the bigger question for policymakers and the executive branch is those bad cases are bad. But in the grander scheme of things, is that an adequate justification? And I don't have an answer to this. Is that an adequate justification to, in essence, stop the regime? Clearly, the government and bipartisan Congresses for years have made the decision that no, that is not sufficient. The second observation is, as I look at what this bill does, it's very interesting to me, the parallels for policies that China has articulated in the last 5 years. The same concerns for supply chain, the same concerns for certain industry sectors. I don't just mean the Made in China 2025, we're talking about their science and technology plans. We have also seen outbound investment restrictions, modifications of outbound investments that have been made, changes, and all designed to meet Chinese national and economic security interests. So I think that to a certain extent, China is leading the effort to examine whether and how this may be appropriate. Now, they are not only leading that effort, but they're taking actions on it. And I do think other countries are looking at it. And I think the third observation I'd like to make is there was a mention of FIRRMA and impediments and obstacles. I can certainly appreciate that any kind of regulation is looked at like an impediment and an obstacle, but it is part of working in a construct where there are limits to the actions that can be taken. And FIRRMA, to use an example, had an express requirement for the president to negotiate multilaterally. And since FIRRMA went into effect, over 30 countries have either examined and enhanced their regimes or created new regimes, and there's another 20 looking at them. So the enhanced information sharing and transparency that the US conducted, not just because of FIRRMA, but because of broader geopolitical issues, has actually developed a framework for people to consider what should be done, and other governments have stepped in. So to Thilo's point, we should be concerned if the US is left all alone. But I think we have some examples that indicate if the US continues to discuss with allies, partners, and China what is out there, I think we may actually find a meeting of the minds. So.
Interesting.
Steve, can I ask a question
Sure.
for Giovanna? Just I'm picking up on something she said, because I remember we had similar discussions a few years ago when FIRRMA first popped up, right? And I think two big concerns were, okay, what is that mandatory filing going to mean for businesses? And what is that mandatory filing and really transaction volume going to mean for US government and its resources and capacity? Can you maybe give us a bit of a first assessment of how all of this has played out? How much has transaction cost increased for US businesses, and how is US government handling that mandatory filing process on the bureaucratic side?
Okay. So I don't usually use subjective judgments, but let me just use one here. I think the CFIUS process has worked quite well. The mandatory filings have not produced a deluge, thousands and thousands of filings. They have not resulted in impediments to transactions, nor have they really, in my experience, delayed the process. I think one originally unanticipated consequence was a slight miscalculation on the number of mandatory filings that actually went into a joint voluntary notice, so that the process didn't end with the mandatory filing. But I think if one were to look at those specific transactions with some degree of granularity, you could probably find some factors in there that wouldn't make it a surprise that that happened. So perhaps there, the assessment should have been the part of the companies and their counselors to perhaps suggest going into the joint filing first and bypassing the mandatory. But I do think that the process has worked, and I don't think it's been a deluge. And it's also resulted in the agencies getting additional resources to be responsive. So the doomsday, in my humble view, has not happened. So.
Let's see. Oh, geez, another from Ken Jarrett. Why does USTR have the lead rather than Treasury?
I think only the drafters of the bill can answer that definitively, but let me give kind of two perspectives on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm really interested in my co-panelist views here as well. So I think USTR is a small and very nimble agency. And it's an agency that has some extensive experience with negotiation, as we know. So putting them in charge of standing up this new process could make a lot of sense from the perspective of wanting to move quickly and to have very little bureaucracy associated with it. I think that also presents a fairly obvious downside. It is a very small agency. Compare it to the Department of Commerce, for example, which has thousands of people, obviously not all of them together, assigned to a particular responsibility. But nevertheless, sort of the idea of the lift required to stand up something of this complexity is going to be a major consideration.
So I think that's an excellent question that you just asked, because it has always been a bit of a conundrum that a national security focused statute, whether you're talking about CFIUS and FIRRMA and the Defense Production Act or this legislation, the control in essence resides in agencies whose equities are focused on commerce and finance. So I think USTR, to Nargiza's point, does appear to be more nimble. And I think it allows for broader jurisdiction by different committees on the Hill, which is important. It gives more visibility. But it is definitely a question to ask, because there is a resource constraint at USTR that would have to be addressed.
Well, certainly Treasury is getting a lot of new employees based upon the expansion of FIRRMA. They're on a hiring binge. The restriction is more the getting security clearances than anything else. They're really hiring a lot. Henry Tillman says, great data, Thilo. We also track China inbound globally. It increased from 135 billion in 2017-18 to 181 billion in 2021. Increases from Asia, including Singapore, the EU, the UK had been, shooting up. Are we closing the door after the horses, the barn door after the horses have bolted?
So first of all, we haven't really talked about the actual investment data and trends in great detail today, but the numbers that were just cited are the official numbers that are showing up in China's economic statistics. And I guess one caveat probably that is important is that those numbers are heavily impacted or distorted by some of the macroeconomic trends that we are seeing with a very strong Chinese currency and relatively high interest rates. There was a lot of incentive on behalf of globally operating treasurers and investors to move money onshore into China over the past 2 years during the pandemic to squeeze out a bit more return. So you'll see a lot of that noise showing up in the official data. If you look at transactions data, the trend is actually a lot less rosy, not surprisingly, right? Given the zero COVID policy and some of the slowing growth and other headwinds that we're seeing. So if you look at transactions data that we're tracking, we're actually seeing quite a bit of decline in 2020 and 2021, which is what you would expect in the current environment, and especially a big decline in mergers and acquisitions into China. We're seeing big companies that are serving, as Eric mentioned, Chinese consumers in those sectors that already have an established footprint in China. We continue to see those expanding, reinvesting, but it's become a lot less vibrant over the past 2 or 3 years. And you can see our preliminary numbers in the report that we just posted on the website today on US FDI into China, and that has come down again in 2021 based on the numbers that we're seeing.
Eric, your members are pretty optimistic and enthusiastic about continuing to invest. Can you talk a little about those numbers and your survey that you did?
Sure. One caveat, obviously, our surveys, focus certainly on China-based executives of American companies, right? So there is maybe a slightly different perspective than the headquarters in the U.S. But with that, certainly consistently, we see our members doing very well financially. Overwhelmingly, at least over 80% of them are profitable. And then 78%, based on our latest survey done late last year, 78% of our members had a positive or slightly positive outlook of the next 5 years. So that was my interpretation was, it compared with the previous survey. It was, certainly 2 different administrations. The current administration, that was last year. So the numbers were more positive. And when you look at how they serve this market, I alluded to this number earlier, over half of our members, 53% of our members actually produce and sell to this market. So China for them is a very important end user market, consumer market in particular. So I think one thing that has not been communicated well in the US is that in fact, this market is very innovative, and a lot of U.S. companies here are trying to tap into the human resources here, and that's why you see these R&D centers set up by U.S. companies here. They co-produce these products with their companies here, right? So U.S. may have a technology, but how to commercialize that technology? And China is a great place to do that because the market is moving very, very fast, particularly based on a digital kind of platform. So I think we need to emphasize that fact that U.S. companies here are here really not only to transfer technology, but more importantly, they commercialize products here, and then they have more mature products, and they will sell into the China market, but also to the rest of the world. And that factor, I think, at least perception-wise, is not well known in the U.S.
Great points. Karen Sutter asks about transparency. Could the panelists discuss transparency issues with regard to deals and transactions that occur through private equity and venture capital? What gaps do you see? How does the law address those issues?
So that's an excellent question, and there is no one law that brings visibility into that because there's currently no requirements similar to what we find for public companies that report through the SEC on certain legal risks and material transactions. Private equity and venture capital world doesn't have similar requirements. So at this point, visibility generally comes when these groups publish press releases, or the companies themselves that have been invested in or bought make public announcements, or sometimes when they engage with customers or they engage with the US government in a commercial relationship, the investments come to light. But right now, there is no specific mechanism for visibility into that area. Nargiza?
So I agree with that. I think it is certainly possible, and we have in-house experience collecting these data on venture capital transactions. But when it comes to private equity, that I think has the least visibility. It's difficult to see transactions, interactions. So that's the one where we see the least of visibility.
Since private equity is just capital, what's the need to have a lot of transparency, I guess would be my question. What's the need to have filings? It's capital. It's just money.
Yes, that's a very interesting way to look at it, because private equity establishes a fund, and there are funds of funds that contributed, and funds and funds and funds of funds, and they establish all these constructs. And what is lost in the noise sometimes is as the money transfers and people get rights for the investments. It doesn't have to be a board seat or an observer seat. You might get a seat on the intellectual property committee of the target that's being invested in. You have other transfers engagements that occur that come as the price of that investment. And so the visibility that's needed is into that aspect of it. And I think that there it's very challenging to really find out what the impact of or influence of the investment is. So I'm not
Talking
sure.
about private equity going into China. So
Yes.
We're worried that we're going to get a seat on the intellectual property committee? I don't understand that.
Well, so let me talk. Usually when private equity, at least in my experience, when private equity invests anywhere, they will put someone who is conversant with the business, conversant with the economic situation, or conversant in the products and technology of the business into which they're investing. And that's it makes perfect business sense to want to monitor your investment and ensure you're getting a good return. A lot of times there are exchanges that occur that result in either transfers of technologies or the development of other relationships that bring in parties, Steve, that were not originally anticipated. And so the tentacles just expand. And that's why it becomes important to have some visibility. Now, you may not learn everything, but there needs to be a start somewhere
Yeah, and maybe Steve, just some additional perspective, and I'm just an observation based on the requests that I'm getting. There is a lot of discussion within USG, especially with regard to venture capital, and to what extent some of these situations may actually constitute a transfer of critical US capability, right? You have a venture capitalist, a seasoned tech entrepreneur that has semiconductor, whatever, quantum computing experience, goes to China with US capital, brings a bunch of engineers with him or her, sets up a fund and a company over there, finances a bunch of startups. I think that is certainly something that the national security community is looking at very actively, and there's a bunch of very good reporting out there in recent weeks and months that shed some light on some of the situations and players involved that everybody can look up.
Dmitry Sevastopoulos asks, what could the Biden administration do in addition to whatever ends up in the legislation, whoever wants to take that? So what can the executive branch do, or President Biden do?
Well, there is the executive authority to invoke IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which does allow the president to take actions in the financial world, not just on the export-import world. So the president has some executive authority to put in a temporary ban or prohibition on certain activity on the basis of national security. We saw some of this with the original order in the Trump administration, Executive Order 13959, which established limits on the investments that could be made in securities of Chinese communist military companies that were on exchanges in the US. So there is some executive authority that exists. Now, it would have to be predicated on a statutory basis, and the most flexible regime happens to be IEPA, but there are limits to that, as the administrations have discovered, because companies have brought lawsuits for those types of actions. But there is some flexibility for them to try something with executive orders.
And I think from the supply chain perspective, we have to also keep in mind the ongoing efforts that the administration already has in the multilateral or bilateral space, negotiating the TTC with the EU, for example, a 2+2 dialogue with Japan. But there is a lot of focus within a lot of open developed economies right now on ensuring supply chain security.
There's a lot of talk about the cooperation, but what appears to me to be happening is the US government is acting without the other governments acting with us. So when we delist Chinese companies, but they can continue to be listed in other places, we are doing nothing but punishing the Americans who do the listings, who work on the listings, punishing NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. So the need to coordinate this with other countries, or in effect, you're playing whack-a-mole, that you were cracking down on this one place, which in this case is New York, NASDAQ and NYSE are both here, and we're not doing anything about the other stock exchanges. And in fact, we can't do anything about the other stock exchanges because one of them happens to be in Hong Kong. So unless if we're going to tell all the major banks, you can't work in Hong Kong anymore, we're doing very little but injuring ourselves. And that's the great risk in a lot of this legislation, that if we don't put the contingency in that this has to be multilateral, and if it's not multilateral, we shouldn't be doing it, because then we're going to create a lot of business for lawyers who are going to structure things so they don't touch the United States. There is no nexus with the United States, but they're in the Cayman Islands or in the Channel Islands, or they're in a place that doesn't have these restrictions. But without the multilateral approach, we're just punishing Americans, which is a little scary to me. Any final comments? Because we're running, I think, very close to the end. Thilo, anything you want to add?
Well, Eric? I guess one final comment here is, again, trying to look back at the FIRRMA process. I think, aside from the letter of the law, part of the motivation here probably also is to rattle cages a little bit. What that FIRRMA process really has done, it has forced American tech companies, and I'm based on the West Coast here. When I moved here initially 5-6 years ago, nobody was thinking about CFIUS, and nobody was thinking about national security, and everything was rosy, and China was the growth story. That has changed dramatically over the past 5 years, which was partially due to that public discussion around FIRRMA. And I think one of the benefits that we might see over the next few months as this is unfolding is that some of these discussions may trickle down into the US business community, and that there may be some of that same process of thinking a bit more about supply chain diversification and to what extent critical inputs are being sourced out of China. So maybe just as a final thought, I think that might be another positive thing that could come out of this process, even if we don't see this bill ultimately pass, or if it should take a different trajectory.
By the way, Nargiza, is financial investment under portfolio investment going to be included in the act?
Not as it's currently drafted. It focuses on transfers of productive capacity.
Eric, any final comments from Shanghai?
Just to follow up on that point about financial investment, I think Thilo in their report mentioned this possibility of just becoming passive investors in China versus active. And I think that would not be good for the US. Over the years, US companies have actively participating in this market. And then China has become a very strategically important market for US companies. So if we're talking about totally becoming passive investors and leaving China, that will be not in the best interest of our companies.
Thank you all so much for kind of making for a very, very interesting, detailed discussion. I'm glad we had the full 90 minutes because it required every minute. I certainly learned a lot from this panel, and I hope our audience did too. Eric, thank you so much for getting up early in the morning to be with us. Thilo, thanks for deferring your dinner. Nargiza and Giovanna, thank you for joining us this late. But great to see everybody, and look forward to our next one. In the meantime, happy Year of the Tiger.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.